The following is an in-depth story analysis. If you haven't seen this film, you might want to before watching this review. Also, there will be discussion about how this film relates to major plot points from other Marvel Cinematic films and television series, especially Captain America the Winter Soldier, Iron Man 3, and Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. It seems to me like making the Avengers would be like juggling flaming swords while riding a unicycle up and down a dolphin's back as it jumped through a ring of fire. What an impossible-sounding assignment. Take 6 characters, 4 of which have already appeared in their own films, each of a totally different genre, all of which have been left in specific status quos, put all these very different people on a team together without their all being unlikable jerk faces, but also without their all magically getting along, because some of them would naturally clash, of course. Make it the most spectacular, exciting, accessible to all audiences summer blockbuster ride imaginable, but make sure it's driven by a believable story, because of course you're Joss Whedon and you're known for the human character stuff. Make sure everybody's favorite character gets enough to do, and oh, by the way, don't forget that this is the big payoff we've been promising since Iron Man, the big sink or swim moment for the whole shared universe thing. And if it doesn't work, you might have just lost us $1 gazillion in the future of the studio that signs your check. Now imagine all that pressure, and it's only the second film you've made in your career. That's like being pretty adept at the unicycle, but suddenly adding all that other insane stuff all at once. But Joss Whedon is used to pressure. At one time, he was showrunning 3 different TV shows simultaneously. He got this job because he knows superhero comics, and he has a track record for writing and directing projects with large ensemble casts. I was a little skeptical when he was first announced, despite being a big fan of his TV work, because it did seem like an enormous leap from doing a relatively small-budget sci-fi movie in Serenity to one of the biggest and most expensive blockbusters of all time. But that strategy has worked more than once for Marvel by now. The Russo brothers were also primarily TV producers and directors prior to Captain America the Winter Soldier, and Community is not even an action show. At least Whedon had set up a lot of stunts and worked with visual effects in the past. But maybe that fresh, story-first perspective is what a Leviathan-sized project like this needs, rather than someone who's made a lot of 2-hour video games that you don't play. Whedon has a knack for minimalism. He's used to cutting production corners in creative ways and doing an incredible amount with very little. So I wasn't sure if he would get overly ambitious with greater resources, or if he simply wouldn't know how to utilize them. And I was skeptical because as much as I love Firefly, I found the pilot a little clunky in introducing all its main characters to the audience in an organic way. I actually thought Serenity handled it better, even for the uninitiated, by making everyone relevant, putting the focus on Mal and River. But since this was a movie, like Serenity, utilizing characters that audiences were mostly already familiar with, maybe it would be more like a real movie than a series pilot. The verdict? Well, I think it's sort of both, because this is the culmination of several films, but also the first in a new movie series that needs to bring these characters together in a way that makes sense. It feels as much like a setup film as it does this giant payoff we've been waiting for 4 years. It has to be something mass audiences can understand and enjoy, even if they've never seen one of the other movies, which gives it that pilot feel. But then it also has to progress these characters from where we've seen them before, so they don't feel regressed or reset for fans that are already invested in them. This, of course, happens all the time in comics. We've got a new writer who has to move on with a continuity he's previously had nothing to do with, and we expect his fresh perspective and his personal take on the material to shine through, but we also expect the continuity to remain consistent. We want a good story first, of course. There's already been some botched continuity in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, especially when you look at end credit scenes, but a lot of people don't notice that because, by and large, the individual stories have been pretty good. Whedon has to continue the story somebody else was telling, but simultaneously make a whole standalone piece. If you look at the box office numbers, clearly plenty of people went to see this that didn't see all the others. So for those of us in the know, this is a setup movie establishing the Avengers team, but it's also Iron Man 2.5, Thor 1.5, Captain America 1.5, Black Widow like 0.8, Hawkeye 3 and The Incredible Hulk 2. And I say it's The Incredible Hulk 2, not because we might never see another standalone Hulk movie, but because I think the arc Banner goes through here is about where he might have gotten to in his own standalone sequel, learning how to turn a negative into a positive and to see the Hulk as a gift as well as a curse. The Avengers is a huge commercial juggernaut, keenly focused on selling tickets first and telling stories second. Now, I don't mean that its writer-director is more focused on the money over the storytelling, but that the folks upstairs have to be more concerned with what will bring the whole universe to the theater over what bozos like me think good storytelling is. That's why Marvel was genius for hiring Whedon. With the mandates they set, such as Coulson must die and such heroes must fight each other at some point, you need a thoughtful, character-driven writer like Whedon to keep us caring about these people throughout the ride. This movie is about the novelty of the history it's making. Finally seeing all these characters who have become instantly some of the most popular in mainstream cinema come together in the same film. It's about the spectacle of seeing them fight each other and then a huge half-hour epic battle, Lord of the Rings meets Transformers style. And while that's all it is to some viewers who really expected something more meaty and more cerebral from Whedon, I think he generally grounds all that action with a real story about control, and how real heroes are defined by it, both self-control and the power, the control they have over others. I like the time the film takes in exploring the fascinating parallels between its main characters, furthering the argument between Iron Man and Captain America's polar opposite ideologies as we've been doing since well before they were ever on screen together, but also creating new pairings and conflicts I would never have thought of. It's a Jenga tower built by the most skilled of players. It has a solid foundation, the structure and design works for the most part, but every now and again, it sways in the process. In his commentary, Joss Whedon calls The Avengers a war movie before it's a superhero movie, and I respectfully have to disagree with him on that point. I've said in numerous reviews that some of the best superhero movies work because there's something else first, making superhero a subgenre of whatever kind of story they're telling. Now, I've gotten a lot of flack for that from folks who say that superhero is a perfectly valid genre all on its own, and saying a movie has to be something else first is an apology for the fact that these characters are so popular. Like, we have to validate their existence and make them feel more relevant and sophisticated. I completely agree with that. Obviously, I'm a little partial to superheroes myself. So let me take this opportunity to elaborate on what I mean by that. A lot of superhero stories are inherently of another ilk also, because superhero is a pretty broad idea, and we still can't all agree on what exactly should fall under that umbrella. What I mean is that generally, great superhero movies that are something else first were also something else first in the comics, and there's a lot of that in Marvel, a universe conceived as a shared universe with stories of nearly every conceivable genre: soap operas, crime dramas, epic fantasies, teenage coming-of-age stories. The Howard the Duck movie, for instance, was played in too much of the superhero vein, though that movie has no idea what the heck it is. We'll tackle that one down the road. It should have been allowed to be the offbeat, risque, adult comedy it was kind of playing at, but in an attempt to create something family-friendly and all-accessible, it turned into a complete mess, and still ended up being something a little awkward to show to children. The Avengers, contrastly, fully embraces what Avengers comics are. Straight up, unadulterated, feel-good superhero stories. There's a bad guy who wants to take over the world, and a bunch of superheroes come together to stop him. Now, there's certainly more to it than that, and we'll get into the relationships and thematic stuff, but I resist the idea that this is a war movie first because A, if it is, it's not a very good one, especially compared to Captain America the First Avenger, and B, as much as I love Joss Whedon, that sounds like an attempt at making it sound more credible, like I was sometimes accused of doing. There are certainly a lot of elements of a war story. War isn't won by sentiment, no, it's won by soldiers, but no more really than the other genres that are all fused together here. That's the thing I like most about it. It doesn't apologize for being a traditional comic book. I like that when you put all these genres together, what you end up with is a superhero movie. It's hard to review The Avengers in a vacuum, because not only is it a culmination of all these other folks' movies, but it's also now heavily informed by everything that's come after it. I enjoyed the heck out of it in the theater, but now, later things in this continuity add to it for me, and other things detract from it. I pick up more on the theme of freedom versus protection now, because that idea is set up here, but it's fully explored in Winter Soldier. Because I haven't read a lot of the character in the comics, I wasn't aware of Black Widow's Soviet conditioning prior prior to seeing the Agent Carter TV series, which informs her background and all the horrible stuff she's done that we hear about when she's interrogating Loki. And I'm impressed with how the Marvel Universe has come alive because of the Battle of New York, how being invaded by aliens has changed the world, and the clever ways the Marvel producers have found to use it to tie otherwise disparate stories together, like using the battle to explain why Hell's Kitchen in Daredevil is suddenly the most dangerous and corrupted neighborhood in New York City. I doubt if it was intentional, but there's some really cool foreshadowing for Winter Soldier with the Cosmic Cube, and the implications for Steve are fascinating. He's working with S.H.I.E.L.D. as he's dealing with Loki, a threat whose insane message hits very close to home for him. All the while, the people he thinks he can trust are trying to build weapons of mass destruction out of the same energy source Red Skull did, and unbeknownst to anyone, there are Hydra agents all throughout S.H.I.E.L.D. So in this movie, Hydra had possession of the Cosmic Cube just before Captain America makes a speech about how if S.H.I.E.L.D. uses this power, they can't hope to understand and make weapons, they're no better than Hydra. Whoa. Only Red Skull could appreciate the bizarre twist of fate that sees the cube that came from Odin's treasure room falling out of Hydra's hands only to be delivered back to them as wolves in sheep's clothing and then to be stolen back by the adopted son of Odin himself. Now on the negative side, Phil Coulson's convoluted resurrection in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. kind of cheapens his death here because of how essential it's supposed to be in bringing this team together. So my point is that it's difficult to critique it as a singular piece because it's in the middle of a larger piece, but it's also in a way a pilot for a really expensive big screen TV show that I've sort of seen more episodes from. The Avengers is an origin story as much as Batman Begins or Man of Steel. It's nice that we already know who most of the principal players are, so we don't have to spend most of the movie establishing what they're all about, like in Ultimate Avengers, the animated film. And of course, our already caring about these people as the protagonists of their own solo adventures has a lot to do with why Avengers was the first film in history to make $200 million domestically in its opening weekend. But it's still the origin of a team, and that team is the protagonist of this movie. We have to establish what this collective entity is, what it wants, what its opportunity for change is that turns it into the Avengers as we know them. So as I always ask with origins, is there a real story here? Or is the origin just a catalyst to get the ball rolling? We don't really get a story until Age of Ultron. And a lot of the great character pairings and parallels might have happened organically if we thrust these people into the action right away. But then the invasion is only the looming threat and then the climax of the film. If we'd just been watching these people stand around waiting for that to happen with no other conflict, it would have been the 2004 Fantastic Four movie all over again. As it is, I think this one's closer to the original X-Men, a setup movie that's still about something, and at least some characters are allowed to grow and change, but with the advantage of our already knowing some of these people pretty well, so everyone's elevated beyond placeholders for later. I do think the title Avengers Assemble is a better title than just the Avengers, and kind of helps to justify just how much assembling is going on through the movie. I kind of wish that hadn't just been the European title, but that's what it was called everywhere. The thrust of the conflict, and the deeper idea at the center of the action, is that our leaders charged with protecting the world are responsible for putting it in jeopardy from a cosmic force, and we need heroes to clean up our mess. Once Fury's duplicity is revealed, once he's compared heavily to Loki, who sees people as subjects who need and want to be ruled, it becomes a story of why a team of heroes is necessary rather than all these individuals. And that's, to me, why dramatizing their origin becomes worthwhile. I like that we need a team, not just because the threat is too big to be stopped by any one superhero, but also because the Avengers represent what S.H.I.E.L.D. should be, a group of powerful people who put their own lives on the line to fight whatever awful force threatens to hurt those who can't defend themselves. Of course, the difference between real heroes and what S.H.I.E.L.D. is at its core is even more sharply defined in Winter Soldier, when we find that some of its ideals about controlling the world and curbing freedoms in the name of protection are there because it's been influenced by Hydra all along. Again, these movies are part of a greater story. Once I know that, there's some added dimension to the scene where Captain America fights Loki in Germany, invoking obvious Hitler parallels as he talks about superiority and that human nature is not to lead, but to be led. By the way, I do find it a little convenient and on the nose that the eyeball he needs to gruesomely steal is in Germany so that an elderly man who remembers the Nazis can stand up to Loki. But it is a cool setting for Cap's first fight scene. The theme of control is a fitting one to explore in a world domination story. It's also natural to deal with that idea in a more cynical and jaded world that, at least in the way it's presented in a lot of contemporary entertainment, presenting itself as realistic, doesn't believe in or trust heroes as it once did. Everyone must have some hidden agenda, some ulterior motive, and so no matter how altruistic or selfless someone seems, there must be a self-serving agenda behind what they're doing. So Avengers, just as these movies have done since the original Iron Man, places itself squarely inside a society with that attitude, and instead of ignoring that people feel that way, it earns its optimism by attacking that point of view head on. It tries to present an argument for why A, we still need heroes, and B, why the world doesn't have to be that way. Most of the film's social commentary comes from Fury's logic of keeping secrets, saying one thing and doing another, and treating the public like simple fools who need a dictator to make their decisions for them. It's not preachy about it, and it doesn't point fingers at any real government entities or representatives necessarily, but the parallels between S.H.I.E.L.D.'s secrets and those of real-world government are pretty clear, I think. So let's explore each of our principal characters and how they function in this exploration of the theme of control. Loki's scheme is motivated entirely by his insecurities and hatred toward his father for raising him to believe he's a rightful heir to the throne of Asgard when he's really the biological son of Laufey, the frost giant, and hatred toward his stepbrother for being the true blood heir to the throne. Loki's message of the illusion of freedom is his temper tantrum against the universe for being unfair to him. He feels like his life was a lie. Those things that he believed himself entitled to were dangled in front of him until they were yanked away by the truth and were never really his. He wants, I think, to take over Earth in order to make other people feel as helpless and small as he did when he discovered the truth about his heritage. The movie dances around this a little, simplifying his motivations, at least in dialogue, to Loki's going after Earth because it's the planet Thor loves and he's jealous of what he feels is his birthright. And all of that is true. But informed by what happened in the first Thor film, I think it's more interesting than that. Loki is in denial about his own significance, so he wants to bring a war to Earth to feel superior. He's transforming himself into the mustache-twirling evil villain stereotype on purpose, because he wants people to see him as this terrible force of nature they can't hope to do anything but kneel before. The conception of the scheme itself defeats his argument. As Thor makes plain several times, the Asgardians aren't really gods, just more powerful than humans, and certainly not more socially or intellectually evolved. People can be simple-minded and take the easy way out, allowing themselves to be controlled so they don't have to think for themselves, certainly. But the film suggests, not unlike Dark City or RoboCop, that people will usually come to the conclusion that they want more than anything else not to have their free will messed with, and Loki is one of them. His obsession with not being controlled is why he comes up with this scary dogma about humans needing someone to make their choices for them. Putting himself above them as a higher being entitled to kingship, he can justify his need to rule. But curiously, Loki talks more about wanting a war than he even does about wanting to rule. As evidenced by his exchange with Thor on top of Stark Tower at the beginning of the Chitauri battle, I don't think he's even thought past the battle. This is the god of mischief, after all. He's more interested in winning games and manipulating people than he is sitting on a throne. He'd probably get bored sitting around and telling humans how superior he is to them. But it's the principle of the thing. He's supposed to be a god and a king, and nobody's taking him seriously. He cares more about not feeling like he's not in control than he does about actually controlling anything, despite having a scepter that gives him the power to make people do his bidding. Interesting that instead of trying to build a following of worshippers to prove his point, he tries to illustrate that humans are sheep by forcing control over them with a magic stick. The hypocrisy is that he's relying on a weapon given to him by a force far more powerful than himself, which threatens to destroy him if he fails to keep up his end of the bargain. His entire scheme hinges on a back-alley deal with cosmic thugs. He can have his street corner to do with as he pleases, but if he doesn't pay up, he's mischief meat. It would almost be an episode of intergalactic Breaking Bad if there was any follow-through. Thanos' right-hand lackey makes that threat, and then, as far as we know, nobody's come knocking after he totally lost the battle and turned the Cosmic Cube over to Thor. Or maybe they just don't know how to get to Asgard. I'm hoping that pays off in one of these movies. Now I want to look at Fury's similarities to Loki, which are unsettling to say the least. They both think people need decisions made for them by a higher authority. Neither trusts anyone, and they're both lacking in vision. Loki, because he doesn't see that he's being controlled by a more powerful force as he's going on and on about real power, his ambitions are just as paltry as he thinks Fury's is. And Fury is lacking in vision because that guy hasn't been born yet. I mean, Fury is lacking in vision because he brought the very sort of alien force to Earth that he was working with the Tesseract to try to protect it from. I like that Fury's eye patch is used as a symbol for that lack of vision. Fury's character arc is about finding a line between doing whatever is necessary to protect the planet and creating the very destruction he's trying to stop, which nearly happens when the Council elects to send a nuclear missile to blow up New York to destroy the threat they're ultimately responsible for calling there. It's a lesson he hasn't obviously fully learned yet when we get to Winter Soldier, but he remains sympathetic and interesting because of his inner conflict. He wants so badly to believe in heroes, constantly pushing for the Avengers Initiative program, and he has authorities controlling him that force him to scrap it in favor of Phase 2. And I think it's fun, by the way, that S.H.I.E.L.D. uses Marvel Studios' real-world terminology there. Phase 2 is also the official term for Marvel's second wave of movies between Avengers and Age of Ultron. Fury helps to demonstrate Loki's flawed logic and his human nature is to be ruled rhetoric. When the Council goes too far, he refuses to go along with the nuclear strike and then tries to stop it. The one thing that all the Avengers have in common is a desire to feel in control of their own destinies, further serving to prove Loki wrong about human nature. As Tony alludes to when he gives a speech to Loki in Stark Tower, and that Coulson verbalizes before he dies, the Avengers have the advantage of conviction. The notion of avenging Coulson, I think, though I don't think it's as necessary or effective as it thinks it is about living up to that optimistic, heroic ideal he died believing in, sacrificing self for the rights of everyone. And, because it's called The Avengers, it may come off as a little forced, but by Grabthar's hammer, somebody's getting avenged. Each of the 6 Avengers has a unique relationship with the idea of control. Captain America and Iron Man are each on opposite ends of the spectrum. The former believes in individual freedoms and will sacrifice his own life without hesitation to protect that for everyone else. He doesn't follow orders blindly, isn't just a drone, as he demonstrates when he snoops around the helicarrier to find evidence that Fury has been lying to them about his intentions with the Tesseract. But he also believes that there are some things he can't control, and he won't try to control what he thinks he can't at the expense of one of his own. Iron Man, on the other hand, must always be in control. He also kind of believes in individual freedom. This is the guy who tried to privatize world peace, but until the film's denouement, it's in question whether he'll sacrifice himself to protect them, whether he still only fights for himself as Steve believes. Sure, he's proven he has a conscience when he stopped making weapons for the government and now he's trying to create clean energy for the world, but he's gotta be in the limelight all the time. He sees a little of Loki in himself when he realizes where Loki has the Tesseract hidden on his giant monument to himself, which is a neat realization, but it's kind of one of those flimsy 60s Batman, it's the only possible answer sort of moments. Tony and Loki both bask in their own brilliance and are both in denial about what they can't control. One of my favorite exchanges in the film is when Steve tells Tony that he wouldn't make the sacrifice play, lay down on a wire and let the other guy climb over him. And Tony responds with, "I think I would just cut the wire." Tony is Captain Kirk. He doesn't believe in the no-win scenario. And he's not even William Shatner's Kirk. He's the Chris Pine version. He's the guy who not only cheats to beat the Kobayashi Maru, he arrogantly eats an apple on the bridge and rubs his awesomeness in everybody's faces. Tony Stark is always in control, until he goes through his arc and is faced with his own mortality. When he first arrives on the helicarrier, he walks around the deck like he owns the place, and very consciously asserts his presence and authority. He has so much of that attitude of, it's just my world and everyone else is living in it, that even when he very reasonably allows Captain America to take charge of the group in the final battle, because Cap's the soldier and the battle tactician, he has to make a show of relinquishing his control when he says, "Captain, call the shots," as if he's still in charge, but he's graciously giving Steve permission to take charge. His outlook changes some by the end, though, when he willingly makes that sacrifice play Steve said he'd never make, and is just lucky enough to survive it. This continues the pattern that Tony keeps slowly building more of a conscience in each film, finding more of his heart, while Captain America America's heart is inherent, always challenged, and he fights every movie to keep it and to not let outside forces change him. Now, Captain America gets a little closer to an actual change here than in his other solo films so far. At least a change in perception, because of the uncertainty and fear of his own outdatedness and irrelevance at the beginning of the film. He feels the closest thing to a loss of control since he was a weakling that couldn't get in the army when he finds himself in a cynical world he fears won't respond to his brand of heroism, and when he finds that things haven't changed for the better in the military as S.H.I.E.L.D. is messing with powers it can't hope to control. By the end, Steve begins to find his place in the world again as he finds that there are still people, like Coulson, who believe in his old-fashioned notion of doing the right thing simply because it is the right thing, and because he gets a team to command that listens to him, and they get to save the world in the right way. That heart motif I've talked about with both the first Iron Man and the first Captain America films continues here as Loki isn't able to control Tony with a scepter because the arc reactor is protecting his heart. Metaphorically, I think this comedically represents that question of whether Tony has fully developed the heart that Steve has naturally. Loki can only take over people with heart, as he says Hawkeye has when he touches him with his scepter. I don't know how intentional this arc is throughout the films, but Tony has to prove he's a true hero by demonstrating a willingness to give up his life to save others, and then in Iron Man 3, he has to come to grips with his own mortality, to admit he's a human being before he can symbolically unshackle his heart, his humanity and decency and conscience from the heart of a machine. Okay, so now that I've given away the big finish of my eventually forthcoming Iron Man 3 review, both Captain America and Iron Man are informed by a loss of control. One, because he remembers what it's like to be helpless, but always tried to do what he thought was right anyway. And the other, who's just now discovering what it's like to be truly helpless and have to rely on others. The importance of that revelation doesn't play out fully in this film, but coming to grips with what he can't control certainly is here. The other four Avengers are also informed by what they can't, or at one time couldn't, control, and each is motivated, to some degree, by guilt. Black Widow is really interesting, penned under Joss Whedon, because she's something of a combination of two of his most popular characters, Buffy and Angel. She's Buffy in the sense that she's a strong female character who is often underestimated and feels a responsibility to fight evil because of a unique skill set forced on her at a young age by a supremely powerful force. She's Angel in that in her past, she hurt a lot of people and has since changed, feels responsible for those actions regardless of whether she really can be held accountable, and now she's on a path to redemption, hoping that each good deed she does will make up for her atrocities, to wipe away the red from her ledger. She's a master manipulator like Loki, and just like Angel, she uses her dark side as a force for good. She has a lot in common with Bruce Banner, too, who also has that dark side he isn't proud of, but hasn't figured out what to do with it yet. They begin to form a bond because of that shared past, horrible things they couldn't help but do, but feel responsible for. She doesn't have the character arc Banner does here. Dealing with Loki seems to reaffirm for her why she's working for S.H.I.E.L.D. and what being an Avenger means for her. Maybe stopping an alien force from taking over the planet will help her wipe out some of that red, and more than just following the orders of the organization that's responsible for that invasion. Natasha and Tony both serve as lights at the end of the tunnel for Banner, who, a little like Steve, is looking for his place in the world, except Steve's looking for relevance after saving the world, and Banner's looking to be useful after wrecking Harlem. He tried to make the world a better place when he attempted suicide, thinking it better without the Hulk in it, and seeing no way to turn that negative into a positive. But the Hulk wouldn't let him die, and he's trapped with no recourse but to keep the beast at bay and help as many people as possible, perhaps to make up for what he unleashed with the Hulk, like Black Widow is doing. I'm glad that plot point, originally deleted from The Incredible Hulk, is made an important moment in his development. Banner is even more tortured than Natasha because she's gotten her personal control back and doesn't have a physical manifestation of her monster that can come out whenever she loses her temper. The difference between them, of course, is that she was a victim of circumstance. She can't help but feel responsible for her own actions, but she was conditioned, while Banner's monster is the consequence of his attempt to play God, like S.H.I.E.L.D. is doing with the Tesseract, in his case trying to recreate the Super Soldier Serum. He's walking proof of the destruction you can unleash when you play with power you don't understand and can't control. But unlike S.H.I.E.L.D., his is a power that, short of a scepter that messes with inhibition or a Scarlet Witch that can get in his head, he actually can temper to a point. Banner represents the self-control both Loki and S.H.I.E.L.D. is lacking. Extreme, powerful emotion that is always there, but that he's learned not to act on. And that's why his big secret is that he's always angry. In his commentary, Whedon talks about the two different Hulks. The Hulk he becomes when he's lost that self-control after holding the scepter and then dropping inside the helicarrier is, I think, the monster that represents the wages of his past sin. He needs Tony and Natasha to help him realize the potential to do good with his monster, just like Tony did when he used his technical know-how to save his own life and then build the Iron Man suit to stop the misuse of his own weapons. And that's the Hulk he becomes when he transforms on purpose. That terrible privilege that Tony talks about. Tony's got a little of that Jack Shephard, I can fix this mentality, and that gets him into trouble sometimes. But he's not always wrong about being able to turn a negative into a positive. And this is a case where that mentality does a lot of good for another individual. Most of the time, Tony can get out of whatever tight scrapes he gets himself into. And Banner, who has Stark's brilliance but not his ego, needs a dose of his overwhelming confidence. Banner's relationships with both Natasha and Tony are natural, layered, and make up some of my favorite scenes in the movie. He and Natasha certainly don't get a ton of screen time, but her presence seems more pronounced to me every time I see it, and I think the similarities between her and Banner are inherent. I appreciate that they aren't spelled out. The similarities between Bruce and Tony are definitely more spelled out, but it works because Bruce needs Tony to explain his arc reactor and invoke the way their origins are the same in order for him to realize the Hulk's potential. There's not a lot to say about Hawkeye here, as he's Loki's glazed-eyed lackey throughout most of the film, but there's some depth to him, and he's kind of the foundation for this exploration of the idea of control. When he comes under Loki's spell, Hawkeye becomes what Loki is trying to prove to the human race it is already, a puppet ready to be used for someone else's bidding. Very often, mind control or other not-yourself devices are used as gimmicks just for the novelty of getting to see a person act wildly out of character. But this one really serves the story, although I wish Barton and Natasha could have had some screen time together to establish their dynamic and history, rather than our getting everything about them in expository dialogue before we finally see them on screen together. Barton starts to blame himself for what he did under Loki's power, and Natasha, who is all too familiar with that feeling herself, tells him not to let himself go down the road she did. It's fitting that Natasha snaps him out of it, with somewhat laughably the age-old bump on the head cure, and I like that Barton, who saved Natasha from her conditioning and is the reason she's on a better path now, gets a taste of what she went through back then. Thor has a little in common with Banner in that he's dealing with the repercussions of mistakes he made in the past. What Thor can't control is the ripple effect of his foolishness that sent him to Earth in the first place. He had the sacrifice moment Tony does at the end of his first film, and although he's now worthy to wield the hammer and he's wiser now, he's discovering that his actions have more wide-sweeping consequences than he ever realized. I like his thoughtful speech to Coulson about how his people think they're so advanced, but they don't wield their power with any sense of maturity, not considering the humans who are affected by their careless wars on Earth. Loki is, in a certain way, Thor's Hulk, the personified deadly consequence of his rash actions. There's a moment after he falls to Earth from the helicarrier, when he stares at his hammer and hesitates. In the theater, I wondered if, for some reason, the hammer had suddenly found him unworthy. After a while, he finally picks up the hammer and resolves to stop his brother and clean up the mess he feels partially responsible for. I think Thor hesitates because he's not sure if he really is worthy. I like the harsh lesson he has to learn, that just because you learn from your mistakes doesn't mean life is suddenly roses and puppy dogs from now on. The past never forgets, and you don't get to magically stop paying for your mistakes just because you're sorry for what you've done. All you can really do is what Thor does. Move forward, remember that who you are now is not who you were then, and never repeat that mistake again. The fact that the hammer still responds to him is proof that he's a different person now than he was before. But what I want to know is why no one in the movie is talking about the man who's really to blame for all this, Odin. If Odin hadn't sent Thor to Earth to become worthy of the hammer, Loki would never have thought to get revenge on him by trying to rule the world he loves. S.H.I.E.L.D. would still have gotten the Cosmic Cube, unless Odin had managed to hang on to the thing in the first place. It did come from his treasure room after all, but Loki wouldn't have had any reason to spy on them and find out it was there. S.H.I.E.L.D. may not have made weapons from the cube, since Fury's justification for doing that is cosmic forces that have them hilariously outmatched, and if Odin hadn't hadn't kept the truth of Loki's true heritage from him and hadn't planted the seed for their sibling rivalry at an early age, Loki may not have become so intent on proving his right to the throne. I realize that if he is responsible, it's in a somewhat indirect way, but he did just kind of throw his problem on Midgard. So all those people Loki killed, the destruction in New York, Hell's Kitchen, it's all Odin. Somebody should send that guy a bill for damages. Okay, so you can put your pen away now and stop taking notes. I've been doing an insane amount of story and character analysis, and it probably makes it sound like I have fewer issues with this movie than I really do. So I want to close this thing out with where I think that Jenga tower is swaying the most. Everywhere the seams start to really show for me stem from story elements Whedon was forced to include. I'm certainly not saying that studio heads and producers don't sometimes have great ideas that improve on what a writer is doing. This process, especially for a movie of this magnitude, is inherently collaborative, and sometimes that oversight can really ground writers and directors and keep them from straying too far off into crazy land. Allegedly, Warner's interference in the production of The Matrix saved that movie from the fate Jupiter Ascending suffered 15 years later. But in this case, I think some of the mandates got in the way of Whedon's creative vision. But I also think he could have done a little more to make some of them feel less shoehorned in and contrived. The first one is the fight scene between Thor and Iron Man that Captain America interrupts toward the tail end. First off, we need more information about what exactly is going on with Thor. Sometimes this movie is juggling so much, it leaves out or glosses over exposition we just need. Thor lands on the S.H.I.E.L.D. Quinjet shortly after Captain America and Iron Man capture Loki. Loki has killed 80 people in 2 days, and Thor is just now getting around to doing anything about it. Sure, there could be plenty of explanations for this. Maybe he was hiking in the woods with his buddies, and Heimdall went off to find him, and after he found him, Heimdall was like, "I've been spying on Midgard," which I like to do because I got no bridge and I'm bored silly, and Loki's there trying to take over the world. Or maybe the dark magic Loki says in his throwaway line to explain how Thor got there without the Rainbow Bridge took Odin 48 hours to conjure up for some reason. For that matter, there really should be some discussion about how long it would take Odin to conjure more magic and bring Loki back to Asgard. Is it more dangerous or harder to do because it's dark magic? Loki takes it as a given that Thor needs the Tesseract to get them both back, like he's certain Odin can't do any more than what he's just done. Loki seems to know how the rules of this magic work, but I don't. So it seems like it's all swept under the rug so we can get on with what really matters, a pointless and avoidable grudge match between Thor and Iron Man. Thor is totally out of character when he lands on that plane, and then Iron Man is made kinda stupid. Thor has built a rapport with humans. He seems to trust them, and he's even come to an understanding with Coulson. So, pray tell, why not just handle the whole thing diplomatically? Why not try to work with Cap and Iron Man there, instead of forcing an incident like that? I understand why, in his mind, Loki is his problem, and therefore he has claim to him. But he acts like he's dealing with primitive people he doesn't trust that won't understand the situation, like he's the Men in Black and they're the ignorant and ill-equipped local government. Then, just so we can have the fight that somebody at Marvel really wanted, Iron Man flies in the middle of Thor and Loki's argument, and he grabs Thor. Why? Isn't the whole point to get Loki back? Why not just fly down, grab Loki, and then speed back to the plane? Even with the Thor acting kinda out of character thing, the fight would feel a lot less contrived to me if it just happened in the air. Thor can fly, and a chase in the sky with Thor and Iron Man could have been just as awesome, if not more so. Then, Captain America shows up, and once again, we don't know enough for what happens to make a lot of sense. Thor puts the hammer down, which is one of my favorite lines in the movie, creating a shockwave that knocks them all over like bowling pins. So I guess Thor knows that Captain America is a super soldier, will be able to withstand this blow without it crushing every bone in his body, and maybe even that the shield is made of vibranium. Now sure, he might know all that, but I'm just not told how. Then, they all stand up, woozy, and just quit fighting. Nobody has to convince Thor to let S.H.I.E.L.D. take his prisoner. He just decides they're at a stalemate, and now he's hanging out on the helicarrier. In his commentary, Whedon talks about how important it was to him that the conflict come from real character motivations rather than a cheap gimmick. And it does, but they're all of a sudden, a lot less logical about everything just for an excuse to fight. Meanwhile, Loki's just sitting there watching the whole thing. Gee, doesn't it seem a little suspicious that he didn't try to escape while we brawled over a few dozen acres of this forest? So it shouldn't surprise anyone when Loki pulls a Dark Knight Joker and is, as Fury says, the only person on this boat that wants to be here. There is some darn sloppy storytelling going on right there. Whedon was also asked by Kevin Feige to kill off Coulson. Now, there are things I like about this, but ultimately it's also a thing that feels a little forced in. Whedon does his level best to give Coulson enough screen time that we'll mourn his death, even if we haven't seen or barely remember him from the other films. My wife didn't remember who he was and was dumbfounded by how big a deal his death was played as. I like his scenes with Captain America a lot. All the stuff about the trading cards is funny, and his nostalgia for Steve's era is charming and endearing. The real trouble with it is, I don't buy that the Avengers really needed Coulson's death to come together the way they do at the end. My issue with it isn't that it happens. I like that one of the casualties in this war is somebody I know and like, and it's a sad, morbid passing of the torch, as he's one of the few things that's tied a lot of these movies together, and now that we're finally putting all these characters in one movie, we really don't need him anymore. He's a bygone remnant of the Phase 1 days. Until he gets his own TV show. I even think the idea of avenging Coulson is fine. I like Tony's line to Loki, his name was Phil, calling back to the joke he made at the beginning of the film when he says his first name is Agent. And I like that Coulson gives Steve a little hope that there are people in the present day, even people in the armed forces, who appreciate his ethics. But I don't see that they need Fury's push. They're emotionally affected by it, sure, but when the chips are down, wouldn't they do exactly what they all do anyway? Or is this a sports movie where everyone needs that one big rallying event to make them work just a little harder to win the big game at the end? Like, somehow Cap wouldn't fight as hard if Coulson hadn't died. Now, I get what it thinks it's doing. It's not about using Coulson's death to bring the whole team together. When Fury gives a speech about the Avengers Initiative and Coulson's death, the only other people in the room are Steve, Tony, and Maria Hill. Maybe his death helps Tony and Steve to see past their differences and function as partners, but the trouble is, we've already seen them work just fine together in the previous scene and when they were at their most volatile. Their emotions are ultra heightened by the scepter and they're about to come to blows, but as soon as the helicarrier is attacked, they stop yelling at each other and do what needs to be done. Why would the attack on New York be any different? Coulson sacrifices himself like Steve says Tony never would, and Tony has a really hard time with Coulson's decision to step in there, which I like, but I have a hard time believing that even if that hadn't happened in the moment, Tony wouldn't take that missile and take it into the rift just as he does. It seems to me like he'd take the risk and maybe be confident enough that he'd come up with some great idea in the moment to get back, but still risking his life because he does care ultimately. I know Tony doesn't think of the sacrifice play first, but that doesn't mean he doesn't have it in him if the right opportunity presents itself before these events, I don't think. And I think the plotting in the third act is a little clunky in trying to manufacture that situation. Especially because I don't quite buy it as a no-win scenario. Steve tells Tony it's going to be a one-way trip, but it looks like Selvig has more time to close the portal. After Tony flies the missile into the hole, Steve tells Selvig to close it. Why? Tony blew up the mothership. All the soldiers and Leviathans are conveniently falling over dead, which Whedon cringes at as much as I do in his commentary, and kind of apologizes for the cheapness of it, but felt like he had to have the triumphant "we won" moment and couldn't come up with anything better because otherwise the Avengers would be fighting for days and days after the movie was over. There's nothing else coming out of that hole now, so why can't you leave it open for just 10 or 20 more seconds, just in case? Oh, yes, so Tony can fall through just in the nick of time. Again, there's a lot here to like. Tony taking a nuclear missile and doing something useful with it echoes his origin in his first film. And I like that the Council's last resort ends up being the thing Tony needs to save the day, proving that if they weren't so trigger-happy, they actually could have solved their own problem. I like that Hulk catches Iron Man, paying off the usefulness Tony predicts Banner will find for the Hulk, and inadvertently having insurance to save his own skin by planting the seed. In a way, he actually still cheats death with his genius and forethought, although there was a lot of luck involved, and Thor would have caught him if Hulk didn't. But that whole situation ultimately seems like a forced payoff to me. I would have liked Coulson's death to have been played as more personal than functional. A brief funeral scene so the other Avengers could mourn him would have been nice. It also seems wrong not to include some sort of reaction from Pepper, who was really close with Coulson and just had a fun-loving exchange with him before he bit the dust. With all that said, The Avengers is an absolute blast, and was well worth the 4-year wait, starting with Iron Man. I was giddy in the theater to see this universe finally come together like this, and I wasn't disappointed. The film gets plenty of mileage, exploring the similarities and differences between our heroes, while still leaving a lot of interesting things to do with them for later. I don't mind that some characters are more at the forefront and have real arcs, while others, namely Black Widow and Hawkeye, serve more supporting roles, both story-wise and thematically. Because they're not generic throwaway characters, and I know this isn't the last I'll see of them. I think it's a decent standalone movie despite being part of an ongoing narrative, though there are a lot of ideas I certainly appreciate more after the movies we've gotten since. I think there's a lot more here than just setting up a team and a lot of thrilling action, though sometimes those goals get in the way of an otherwise thoughtful, character-driven story. The long 24-esque real-time battle at the end is exhilarating, and while I don't like that the Chitauri are so easily dispatched of once Tony goes into the rift, I do appreciate that I always know who's doing what, why, and that everyone feels very much in character during the battle. They feel like real people, even though some of them are superhuman. Even Captain America shows fatigue after fighting off hordes of Chitauri. There are a lot of great setups and payoffs, and most of the humor plays for me, though it sometimes feels a little self-indulgent or just a little too cheesy. I go back and forth on the slapstick, like the knocking characters out of frame stuff. It is pretty classic comic book and it's fun for the kids, but as an ongoing joke, it feels almost too cartoony for this material. And a few lines just don't quite play for me, like Black Widow's "I don't see how that's a party" during the battle. She was trained by the Soviet Union, but not raised on another planet. Surely she would get that Tony's "I'm bringing the party to you" is a figure of speech. But all in all, it's an incredible visual achievement and a breath of fresh air with how much fun it is. This might seem like a surprisingly low score, given all the attention I've given to analysis with this one, but with some of that clunky plotting and all my issues with the ending, I'm going to give The Avengers a 3 out of 4.